Welcome to this two-day conference on Imperial Inequalities, States, Empires, Taxation and Reparations. I'm Alex Cobham, Chief Executive at the Tax Justice Network, and we're delighted to be hosting this in collaboration with Gominda Bambara and Julie McClure, and I'll say more about them in a moment. But we're here today looking backwards and forwards, if you like, at the role of empire and taxation and how that's played out in a set of different ways. 1 year ago, almost to the day, Prime Minister Boris Johnson won election and set out his new programme for the UK's government, what he called a blueprint for the future of Britain. And he said, "I do not think it vainglorious or implausible to say that a new golden age for this United Kingdom is now within reach." The question that we might ask, thinking about the British Empire, is where does that future begin from? Now, we recently launched a new annual report called The State of Tax Justice. And what that shows is that in one particular aspect, the UK empire continues very much to play an important role in the world. In particular, we looked at the scale of tax revenue losses around the world to corporate tax abuse and to individual tax abuse through offshore tax evasion. What we find is that the UK itself is responsible for about 10% of those global revenue losses, perhaps $40 billion a year. When we put that together, though, with the Crown dependencies and the overseas territories, the remainder, in some sense, of the UK's offshore empire, that network together is responsible for more than a third of the global revenue losses suffered by other countries. In other words, it remains the biggest single player in this aspect of the global economy. Now, we're facing discussions both about the UK's renewal, but also the kind of inequalities left behind and the structurally embedded racism within the UK and in other countries, at the same time as we're trying to unpick what the legacies of those empires were in broader and deeper ways. And that's really what this conference is about, looking both backwards and forwards at the role of empires and the role of tax particularly within it, but also forward at how that's playing out and indeed the future of policy areas, including discussion of reparations. So the next 2 days we'll see a series of panels and keynotes about this. Now, before I introduce Professor Bambara, let me just make a couple of housekeeping notes. You are all very welcome to chat to each other and indeed to everyone using the chat function to put forward specific questions for the presenters on panels. Though, please use the Q&A, and there you can vote up and vote down questions from other people also, and that will allow us to make sure we have the best discussion of the key points that we can. But the reason, in some sense, that we're holding this event is because of a new book that's now in the planning stage, and many of the papers that you'll hear presented are chapters of that book. And the editors of that book and the prime movers in this whole process are, as I say, Gominda Bambara and Julie McClure. Now, Gominda is Professor of Post-Colonial and Decolonial Studies in the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex, and Julie McClure is Lecturer in Late Medieval and Early Modern Global History at the University of Glasgow. You'll meet Julia in the next session, but for now, let me hand over to Gominda, who can say perhaps a bit more about the book and the ideas that brought her and Julia to bring that forward, and then take us into the next session. So, Gominda, please.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Alex. You framed the themes of the conference very nicely there, and I would just like to add my thanks to everybody who's come along today to listen to the papers and engage in the discussions that hopefully we'll be having over the next couple of days. I'd like to just say a few words about where the idea for this project came from. I mean, many of the papers, as Alex mentioned, that will be presented emerged from a book project that I'm organising together with Julia McClure on imperial inequalities, taxation and welfare across European empires. Now, the premise for this project is that the contemporary inequalities that configure our world have their roots in colonial histories and processes, and that to understand and then to effectively address these inequalities, we have to understand how they emerged and how they continue to shape the worlds within which we live. Europe is the wealthiest continent on the planet. Its politicians and people often think that that wealth is a patrimony or a national inheritance. However, it derives from colonialism and the very same historical processes that have left other places in poverty. Now, formal decolonization may have reduced the flow of wealth from elsewhere to Europe, but it's neither stopped it, nor has there been any reparation for the earlier histories of domination, oppression, or extraction. And of course, we've learned recently that the UK has just cut its aid budget with a claim that national wealth should be spent on national citizens and not on unrelated others. So the conference includes a number of presentations about modes of taxation and welfare across a variety of European imperial states, and also addresses their post-colonial legacies into the present. Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise that wealth moved from the colonies, the imperial hinterlands, to the metropole, but it's remarkable how little systematic research there is on this topic. Rather, there's an underlying assumption that the wealth of core European states was generated endogenously by the invention of its own people, and that what happens beyond their borders is not important to understanding what happens within them. Such accounts, however, rest on the misunderstanding of these states as being nations and having empires, instead of more properly understanding them as being imperial states. To understand them as imperial states would bring within a common frame of analysis events and processes that are otherwise incorrectly disaggregated. It would recognize the colonial processes upon which subsequent imperialism depended and through which capitalist modernity develops. Despite this, however, the imperial context has been effectively erased from much social scientific understanding. Gary Runciman, for example, argues that British social and political structures, what he calls institutional modes of production, coercion, and persuasion, were all fully formed by the early 20th century. And empire forms no part of his account of their development, and equally importantly, its demise would seem to have no implications either. So there's a sense in much social science that what happens within the nation can be understood simply in terms of what happens within national boundaries, despite these states having been empires across their history. In contrast, then, many of the presentations over these 2 days locate European states as fully imbricated within an imperial political economy, and they investigate the relations of extraction, to use Martin Daunton's resonant phrase, that characterize that wider political economy. The presentations examine the broader imperial provenance of the material resources at the disposal of national collectivities. And while taxation is usually understood in national terms, where it's often presented as a quid pro quo for belonging and for sharing in the benefits of welfare regimes, it's also something that's mobilized in an imperial context, and usually without any reciprocal aspects of belonging or sharing, as we will come on to see in many of the presentations. So as such, some of the questions that we hope to address over the 2 days are, what new perspectives on the relationship between state and empire and the nature of sovereignty do we see from the perspective on taxation and welfare? What does this tell us about relationships between public and private property? What role has taxation and welfare played in creating imperial inequalities? Do these new understandings challenge standard theories about the nature of global inequality? So with that, we'll move directly onto the first panel on institutional and fiscal issues. So this panel examines the ways in which imperial states were financed And we have papers that look at the Spanish Empire, the British and the French empires, and which also examine internal inequalities in Sierra Leone, a composite colonial state. We have 4 absolutely fantastic papers. First up will be Dr. Julia McClure, who's lecturer in late medieval and early modern global history at the University of Glasgow. And as mentioned, she's also one of the co-organizers of this conference. And she'll be speaking on welfare imperialism in the Spanish Empire. After Julia, we have Dr. David Brown, who's a research fellow in history at Trinity College Dublin, who will be speaking on the Great Gauge. He will be followed by Dr. Madeleine Woker, who's postdoctoral fellow in international and public affairs at the Watson Institute at Brown University, and her paper is The Cost of Cheapness, the Meaning of Financial Autonomy. And this panel will close with a paper by Laura Channing, who's a PhD candidate in economic history at Gonville and Case College, University of Cambridge, on internal inequalities, taxpayers, taxation, and expenditure in a composite colonial state. Each panelist will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have ample time for discussion. So please do put your comments and questions in the chat box and also the Q&A box. And with that, I'll pass on to Dr. Julia McClure.
Thank you very much, Gaminda. Thanks for this introduction and for summarising the volume and the project so well there. And thank you also to Alex and for this opportunity to engage with the fellow panelists and also with the Tax Justice Network. So my interest in this topic of imperial inequalities comes from my long-standing interest in the intellectual, political and economic history of property and empire. And I'm interested in particular in how natural resources such as land, forestry, minerals and fisheries became subject to various property regimes, how different claims to public, private and common property have been articulated and defended, and what role beliefs about poverty, charity and welfare have played into the development of systems of property, empire and inequality. So the notion of welfare, of common good and public benefit have long been central to the intellectual and legal ecology of property. The mechanisms of appropriation, of claiming exclusive use or benefit rights of particular resources, which are at the origins of inequality, did not operate merely as naked power, but via a constructed framework of justification and legitimacy. The notion of welfare was an important part of the infrastructure of imperial states. So my chapter in this volume looks at the welfare in the establishment of imperial states. So while states and empires have been treated as distinct political units, from their emergence in the late medieval and the early modern periods, we see that nation states and empires were in fact co-constitutive units. In historical processes of imperial state formation, the boundary between public and private property was blurred, and there were complex trade-offs between different forms of economic, political, social, and cultural capital. Taxation and welfare facilitated the movement between public and private property and helped structure the inequalities of imperial states. So in the short time I have with you today, I'm going to give a brief summary of the role of taxation and welfare to move between public and private property and construct the Spanish imperial state and how this influenced the patterns of inequalities. So the Spanish imperial state emerged in the Iberian Peninsula at the end of the Middle Ages through the conquest of Muslim territories. The crown did not rely on its own resources or its own treasury to finance this conquest, but instead it devised a strategy of partnerships with private individuals and groups, which would later be repeated during the conquest of the New World in the 16th century. The conjoined enterprise of Iberian state and empire formation from the offset relied on public-private partnerships. The Spanish crown expanded across the Iberian Peninsula during the so-called Reconquista by franchising sovereignty. It offset the cost of military expenditure by promising private individuals privileged access to resources in the newly conquered lands. So the crown effectively leveraged its religiously imbued power to overcome its shortages in economic power. The Spanish imperial state was made in the Middle Ages using the political capital of the crown and the economic capital of subjects. This was good for the crown as it was a way to finance the conquest, but it was also bad as it entrenched privileges known as fueros, making it hard to raise taxation. In the Americas, The Crown did not give these land grants at first because it wanted to avoid the way that entrenched privilege had developed in the Iberian Peninsula. But it did promise future wealth from empire as a payment to the conquistadores. So one significant legacy of this public-private partnership pathway to imperial state formation was that the royal domency, the crown lands, did not constitute a significant set of assets for the Spanish crown, since it granted privileges to the conquerors of these lands as a way of financing that conquest. As a consequence of these entrenched privileges, the crown had to bargain with the cities in order to raise revenue through taxation. So unlike the model of the fiscal military state, the crown had to justify why it needed the money. And so while foreign wars in the ruler's interests were not seen as a compelling reason for draining the public purse, claims about welfare could be more convincing. So given the crown had to bargain for resources from corporate entities, the use of wealth had to be justified. As the bargaining system could be slow and cumbersome, the crown often resorted to other forms of direct taxation, which was more aggressive and more likely to increase inequality. The crown also looked to other forms of revenue to taxation in order to fund the imperial state projects. One was the donativo, a so-called voluntary donation, which, as you might imagine, was not quite voluntary. Donativos could be a recommended price for a particular concession, a privilege or post, or simply known as a gift, and has been described by one historian as elaborate begging on behalf of the crown. The crown also loaned money from its subjects in return for public bonds known as juros, and this was used to finance the imperial state projects in the Americas. So the crown did repay these, and so capital was moving between public and private ownership. Since private subjects lent to the public purse, the Spanish Empire has been described as a shareholder empire. Through this system of privileges, loans, and leveraging and taxation, you see the ways in which the lines between public and private property was blurred in the formation of the imperial state. So the crown's political capital, its claim to legitimate sovereignty, which enabled it to leverage its economic capital by granting the future returns on imperial resources, was underwritten by the cultural capital of the church. Christian beliefs permeated the Spanish imperial state's claim to legitimate sovereignty, and beliefs about the importance of providing for the poor were especially important. So when Charles V became the ruler of the Habsburg Empire and into Spain, the first act that he performed was to give 11 million maravedis to institutions in the Diocese of Toledo, as long as they continued to exercise continual care for the poor. So Charles V was theorized by contemporary political thinkers and supporters as a universal monarch, a claim to political authority based upon an obligation for welfare and protection. So the crown sought to establish the legitimacy of its sovereignty in the New World to its European audience, if not to its home, if not to the Native Americans, by presenting itself as the protector and provider of the Amerindians. The Amerindians came to be classed as personas miserables, the same way that the poor were described in Europe. And this meant that they were not just poor, but also in need of protection by the crown. So depicting itself as the provider and protector of the weak and the poor was important to the construction of the paternalistic authority that was at the bedrock of Spanish imperial states authority. The crown instituted the office of Protector de Naturales, protector of the natives, as part of the structure of imperial governance. The provision of welfare, like other aspects of the foundations of the Spanish imperial state, showed the overlapping and fluid relationships between public and private forms of economic, political, and social capital. The crown wanted the construction of the Spanish imperial state to be self-funding, and this included its ambitious plans for welfare. So early on in the conquest, the crown ordered the viceroys, audiencias, and governors to establish hospitals across the Americas, and it also wanted this kind of welfare network to pay for itself. It established a particular tax, the tomen de hospital, so that the indigenous people were effectively made to pay for their own welfare institutions, which in turn were used to justify the sovereignty claims of the imperial state in the Americas. Additional to this, there was a kind of lots of revenue flowing through these welfare institutions, and private individuals took the opportunity to try to capitalize on those gains. the indigenous people were not, they were conscious of this and also tried to resist both the formation of the welfare institutions and also the payment of the Toman tax. So welfare was part of the infrastructure of the empire and helped justify forms of extraction and control. People also used the welfare system to their advantage. Private individuals could appropriate public funds by taking over welfare institutions, such as the indigenous hospitals. But people across the empire also used the tax-exempt status of charitable institutions to hide private wealth. So, for example, indigenous communities could pool their wealth in confraternities, which were charitable religious organizations that provided welfare at a local level, and they were also a way of protecting some of their pooled wealth from unscrupulous tax collectors. Similarly, elites could also use charitable institutions to hide wealth from taxation. So the welfare infrastructure of the Spanish imperial state was never intended to reduce inequality. Pre-modern charity did contain a principle of distributive justice, but this was underpinned not by the notion that everyone must be treated equally, but that people must be treated according to their status. It was defined by the judicial principle of equitas, more equivalent to equity than equality. The provision of welfare and the performance of charity was central to the political programme of empire, but this was not concerned with reducing inequality, but maintaining the socio-economic status of various groups as a way of maintaining the political order of the Spanish imperial state. So to sum up, the formation of the Spanish imperial nation was the product of public-private partnerships, the leveraging of political capital in return for economic capital. This limited the Crown's capacity for taxation, but it mobilized private capital in other ways. And at the same time, the Crown's capacity to, at the same time, private individuals were able to benefit from public institutions. Welfare played an important role in the fabric of legitimacy and political capital of the Spanish imperial state. And at the same, and welfare institutions of the Spanish imperial state offered some poverty relief, but at the same time, they helped code the imperial inequalities.
Thanks so much for that, Julia. It was really interesting to hear about the ways in which this idea of welfare comes to play a central role in the establishment of empires, or specifically the Spanish Empire here. So we'll carry, so please, again, if you've got comments or questions for Julia, put them into the Q&A and we'll pick them up at the end. So we'll hear from all speakers first. So next we'll move on to Dr. David Brown.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about Britain's first colony, its eventual exploitation to the point of collapse, and the expansion of England's colonial horizons once this work had been accomplished. So Britain's first colony was Ireland, invaded from Wales in the late 12th century and controlled in parts from a Pale of settlement centred on Dublin. Colonisation expanded greatly during the early years of the 17th century, when the development of English and Scottish plantations in Ireland was at its peak. Britain's colony in Ireland was almost lost with the Irish Rebellion of October 1641, and to crush this rebellion, an almost equally rebellious at the time English Parliament colluded with Charles I in April 1642 to launch the Adventure for Irish Land. The aim of this adventure was to crush the Irish Rebellion, and the investors were to put up £1 million, which was a fortune in those days, and they were to be repaid with 2.5 million acres that was to be taken from the landed estates of the defeated rebels. This collective punishment came to encompass all Irish landowners and led to a war without end, because if you surrendered, you lost everything. So you had really no choice but to carry on, and it carried on for another 12 years. The land, which was high quality, productive agricultural, let's say European land, has been carefully husbanded over many centuries, but it was priced for this particular scheme at between 1.5 and 6 pence per acre, which was similar to the nominal cost of undeveloped land in England's North American colonies. So they were equating land that they were taking in North America that was relatively underpopulated with land that was intensively farmed and intensively populated in the neighbouring country. So it's this land that comprises one of two pillars for the Great Gauge, which is the name I've given to this method of extracting and extracting assets from a colonial possession and then refinancing it and using the money to be able to do something else. The second pillar was taxes, and the taxes were based on the land. By a gauge, I mean the business end of the mortgage, which is the loan secured against an asset. The security dies when the loan is paid off, hence the mort part of the word. The better the security, the better the mortgage, and the rent roll of an estate was the best guide to its value. Now, they had all these rent rolls. They knew precisely what all this land was worth when they began all this. They simply ignored its actual value and invented a sort of area-based scheme. The supposedly best mortgages could and were sold on. The modern mortgage was perfected in England during the time of the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in the 1650s. So while Cromwell was busily conquering Ireland, English financiers were inventing what's now basically was very similar to the modern mortgage, the main difference being that the bank, the person who let out the mortgage, actually owned the property until the mortgage was paid off. So the person who received the land under this adventure was basically freed of any obligation to look after it. English investors were keen to take advantage of this new financial wizardry by trading debts secured on this land in a country they didn't know and they'd never visited. And this should sound like a familiar story. The gambling on mortgages that took place then, the outcomes a few years later were very similar to the gambling on mortgages that took place 20 years ago, and the eventual banking collapse that happened in the early part of the 21st century. A similar banking collapse happened later on in the 17th century and early 18th century. So the gambling of mortgages is still with us. But in the 17th century, it was not uncommon to also use the future receipt of taxes as a financial instrument with predictably disastrous results. Borrowing by the state against future taxes was called tax farming. A tax would be selected, say the expected income from the excise on tobacco, but it could be anything. And merchants would offer the crown a lump sum in return for the right to collect the tax. This lump sum invariably became a high interest loan that was only repaid as the taxes were collected. The farmer had two options at this point. Well, three if you count conscientiously fulfilling the contract, which never happened. Option one was to collect the taxes as slowly as possible, maximizing the interest and the profit that came from the deal. Option two was to sell the farm on with or without the debt. And this becomes our second pillar. This is the second class of financial instrument that could be traded based on this Irish land. We can trace the flow of money from both land and taxes actually from a couple of original documents to make a case study, but imagine this case study is duplicated in lots of places. So I'm just going to share a screen now. So we can maybe see a couple of things. So can people see that?
Yes.
Okay, so to facilitate the mass confiscation of land, Ireland was mapped in extraordinary detail by the Cromwellians. These were done by somebody called William Petty, who was an army doctor before he got into mapping, and he was better known for raising the dead. He replaced a surveyor by the name of Benjamin Worsley, who'd actually started off as an alchemist before he got into mapping. Most of these stories are populated by people who we would describe in Dublin as being mainly chancers, but they all achieved quite high office and quite enormous wealth. The maps served two purposes. They would form the basis of a mortgage particular. This was to do with the invention of the mortgage in England. An accurate map was essential to create a mortgage. And they also provided an accurate measure to collect a new land tax called the quit rent, a tax so generous to the monarch that it had the potential to convert Ireland into a major contributor to overall royal revenues. So here's the same map. We can see it in a close-up, which is a single civil parish with small areas shown as townlands named and numbered. Well-constructed buildings, churches and settlements are all shown in great detail. And the surveyors were very keen to include everything of value, basically to attract more people to invest in the land and to enhance the value of the mortgage once this map was made known to the financiers. A table was produced for each parish, setting out the area of land in every townland, with each parcel in the table linked to the map using a number. It's actually a very clever system, and it's the first time it had been used on such a wide scale. It allows the land parcel to be tied to its new owner. You can also see who it was taken from, which is helpful for us historians. And with the area known, you can accurately tax the land. And I will look at somebody He's down in the bottom right corner. This fellow Richard Dashwood. He's one of the Dashwood brothers. Through the Dashwood family, we can trace what happened next. Dashwood acquired his stake through a grubby black market and land vouchers sent to demob English soldiers in lieu of their pay arrears. The Promotions couldn't actually pay their soldiers in Ireland. The new model army could pay their soldiers in England, but in Ireland this wasn't much of a consideration. There was at the time much talk of creating a new class of sturdy English yeomen to repopulate and civilize the newly flattened colony. But in reality, most soldiers just wanted to go home. They didn't want to set up a new life in a place that they didn't know and nobody liked them. Consequently, they sold their land vouchers as quickly as possible and for a fraction of their value to speculators, both in Ireland and in England. The high quality surveys paid for by the state, although in fact the surveys are also paid in land vouchers. In the case of William Petty, he received half of a county, Kerry, meant that the lands could be mortgaged for their full value, giving a cash windfall immediately to the hungry speculators. So once they mortgaged the land, they didn't own it anymore. They didn't have to do anything with it anymore. The person who bought the mortgage had to collect the rent and pay the mortgage off. So they were actually free with a pile of cash. So this windfall in land was intended to bring about a windfall in taxes. But after 2 decades of conflict, Ireland was left with a ruling class that was too inept and too self-interested to collect taxes for the king. So on this slide, it's actually difficult to read. I've highlighted another 2 of the Dashwood brothers, though, William Dashwood and George Dashwood. This is from the Irish State Papers held in the National Archives in Kew. It's a letter from Charles II, written in probably desperation in July 1669, listing all of his Irish taxes. That's his land taxes, his taxes on customs and excise and poll taxes and every other tax that these rather enterprising people managed to dream up. They were all leased in one block to a consortium of merchants based in London that included the Dashwoods. For Charles, this was a quick bit of ready cash. For Ireland, this was a financial disaster that led to the bankruptcy of the Irish Exchequer in less than 2 years, because although they collected the money in, they didn't pay any of the money out. The money was diverted and used for something else. So you could be forgiven for thinking that this episode would be the end of the Stuarts' involvement with the Dashwoods and their financial circle. But our final documents realized that this involvement was actually just the beginning of what became a rather long story. So on this slide, we see the attendance at a meeting of the Court of Assistance of the Royal Africa Company a few months later. The Royal Africa Company was established in 1671, just after the collapse of the Irish Exchequer. And here we find Samuel Dashwood again, together with several luminaries of the Irish land market of the late 1660s. We can see Thomas Crisp on this list. He's a long history trading in Africa and a long history buying and selling Irish land. Sir John Robinson, one of the leading merchants of London, and Thomas Vernon, among others. The Vernon family owned a big chunk of north of Dublin City, and there's still a few streets named after him. And actually, fully 1/3 of the shareholders in the Royal Africa Company were invested in Irish land at this time, including some of the largest players in that market, together with most of the people involved in the tax farming consortium, who were among the leading shareholders of the Royal Africa Company. At the apex of the Royal Africa Company, we find the 2 Stuart brothers, Charles II and James the Duke of York, who became the future James II, along with their cousin Prince Rupert. And Prince Rupert was the one who actually had some experience in slave trading before all this had started. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 created an opportunity for England for the first time to drain vast riches from a colonial possession and for the royal family, with a select group of moneyed courtiers, to indulge themselves in their fantasy of creating a global empire, because England didn't really have a global empire at this stage. It had a stack of merchants and some small islands in the Caribbean. But this was the beginning of this great leap forward into empire. Money that should have been paid to Irish pensioners to improve Irish roads, this is what these taxes were originally intended for, was instead stolen and used to fit out slaving ships. Thereby, through a mixture of greed and incompetence, England's first colony, Ireland, provided the financial means by which the Stuarts could develop a network of outposts along the coast of West Africa and become serious players in the trade of enslaved people for the first time. And really just to finish, so what we've seen is that one type of exploitation paved the way for another, magnified to the miracles of credit and gunpowder. And in many ways, this became the template for what happened next. So that's me done.
Great, thanks so much, David. We had a slight issue with audio, I think, so just for the future speakers, just to be aware of the microphone and the direction of the voice, I think that sort of helps. But that was a really interesting paper in terms of thinking about the ways in which the state borrows against, in a way, its own assets and assets that it acquires through particular sorts of endeavours in order to fund then future, what we might want to call adventures, or use other terms later on in the discussion as well. But we'll move on now to Dr. Madeleine Woker, who will give us the next presentation.
Yes, thank you. So I'll just share my screen. Here we go. Can everyone see it? Yes. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to present my research at this important and timely conference. In the next 8-10 minutes, I will present my contribution to this collective volume, which I titled "The Cost of Cheapness, the Meaning of Financial Autonomy in the French Colonial Empire." So I should just say that this is part of a broader political history of taxation in the French Empire during the first half of the 20th century that I'm currently writing. So the key argument I will make in today's talk is that when French imperialists declared colonies financially autonomous in 1900, what they really did was to entrench the transfer of the tax burden of empire onto colonized populations, who, of course, had no say in the process. So it is often said that colonial empires in the 20th century were run on the cheap or on a shoestring. You might have heard these expressions, and that colonial states were forced to become self-sufficient. However, the implications and politics of this cheapness imperative, as it were, are often left unquestioned. And what I want to do here is to critically unpack these loaded expressions and offer a quick overview of the politics of imperial finance in late 19th century France in order to explain why and how the French Parliament ended up voting two fateful laws, making both colonies, that is, old territories of the French Empire, which fell under the purview of the Ministry of Colonies, and Algeria, which was a special element of the French Empire because it fell under the purview of the Ministry of Interior, how these two laws made those territories financially autonomous. Very much like other European colonial empires, the French Empire was a globalizing and hierarchical project, which I argue created a racialized imperial fiscal hierarchy, which placed the interests and livelihoods of metropolitan citizen taxpayers above those of colonial subject taxpayers. My main argument here is that the imperative to preserve the very precarious and highly unequal fiscal bargain of fin de siècle France is what ultimately led to the transfer of the tax burden of empire onto colonized populations. This political imperative forced decision makers at the time to attend to the needs of the metropolitan taxpayer, which itself became a political category. So to illustrate this point, I thought I'd show you this caricature, which was published in the widely read moderate Republican satirical newspaper Le GRELOT on June 28, 1896. This was, of course, a moment when France was deeply invested in the geopolitical game of high imperialism and waging brutal wars of conquests in Asia and Africa, notably Madagascar. This specific caricature came out just a few days after the Chamber of Deputies had unilaterally voted the abolition of native slavery in Madagascar in order to first justify conquest in a context of growing public discontent about the fiscal and human cost of the second French Malagasy War. So on the upper left-hand side of the image stands a proud French Marianne, which is the emblem of the Republic. She's standing at the helm of a long line of recently emancipated people. Immediately beneath them, the caricaturist drew crawling French metropolitan taxpayers painstakingly pulling a heavy cart loaded with sacks of various sizes. If you look a little closer, you might notice that the sacks are tagged with various names. Prestation, for instance, which meant labor tax, douane, customs tax, impôt direct, impôt indirect, direct and indirect taxes, and so on. At the bottom of the page, the legend reads ironically, "The Chamber of Deputies just abolished slavery in Madagascar to the great joy of the French worker." It is clear, I think, that the caricaturists here were invested in conveying the idea that French metropolitan taxpayers were now being transformed into enslaved people themselves, forced to pay the cost of France's imperial ventures. So political caricatures portraying suffering and oppressed taxpayers were, in fact, a common feature of the Belle Époque satirical press. But this particular image, I think, stands out for its stark illustration of the racialized nature of French taxpayer citizenship in the French imperial state and the close intersection between domestic distributional conflicts and colonial expansion. So it is really in this particular political setting that French deputies were debating imperial expenditures in the late 19th century. The financial autonomy laws that I mentioned in the introduction organized a clearer distinction between the metropolitan budget on the one side and local colonial budgets on the other, making those colonial local budgets responsible for all civilian and police expenditures. The laws also introduced a provision stating that colonies could in the future be requested to reimburse military expenditures incurred on their soil. Finally, they made colonies in Algeria into separate legal entities with the ability to issue debt. So you see, autonomy did not mean that inhabitants of the colonies gained more fiscal freedom. On the contrary, it seems like the laws worked very much like a preemptive and disciplining measure, effectively making life much more difficult for colonies should they require financial help from the metropole. Of course, this stricter budgetary separation did not mean that colonies were, became fully self-sufficient overnight, but it did set the stage for what I call a low-cost empire. And interestingly, this turn to autonomy was also happening in other European and Euro-American empires. In fact, the French were explicitly inspired by the British example. Joseph Caillaux, who was Minister of Finance at the time and who is mentioned on the slide here, was eager, in fact, to compare British and French colonial finance and thought that France should follow the same path. Generally, a flurry of colonial experts, as they were called at the time in the United States and Europe, were obsessed with running low-cost empires and obsessed with this cheapness imperative, at the expense, of course, of the majority of colonized taxpayers in the empire. As economic historians such as Élise Villery or Denis Cognot in the French context have shown, but also as contemporaries themselves understood, colonial financial autonomy translated into a much increased tax burdens for the vast majority of colonized taxpayers. While European settlers often enjoyed low direct tax rates, and often in fact full exemption, colonial subjects paid a disproportionately high level of taxes. To cite just a few examples, in colonial Algeria, the turn to autonomy resulted in the creation of a number of new taxes, most importantly, the tobacco tax, which fell heavily on local population, on top of the so-called Arab taxes, which were also levied on, which were in fact only levied on Muslim Algerian non-citizens. In Indochina, autonomy led to the creation of the much hated fiscal monopolies on alcohol, opium, and salt. In France's West African colonies, the early 1900s overlapped with the mass introduction and increase of capitation taxes. And these heavy tax burdens generated synchronous and violent tax revolts throughout the empire during the first half of the 20th century. It also created a situation of endemic austerity, not for European civil servants, of course, whose salaries were paid by local taxes, but for the vast majority of the colony's populations. By the interwar period, imperial officials like Albert Sarraut began to criticize the very principle of autonomy, because what autonomy had ended up doing was, of course, to aggravate fiscal inequities and to turn empire into what I call a space of fiscal exception. To make just a very quick reference to Professor Vanessa Ogle's work, which you will hear about later today, it is interesting to note, for instance, that returnees of empire, European returnees of empire, who sometimes, brought back their money to tax havens like Monaco or Switzerland in the 1950s, often invoked the principle of colonial financial autonomy to justify their specific status as overseas French taxpayers. So yes, I'm happy to answer any other questions you may have during the Q&A, and that's really what I wanted to tell you today. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that, Madeleine. And again, incredibly interesting themes, and particularly as we begin to explore these issues in more depth, thinking about the ways in which these hierarchies sort of cross-cut and also shift both between the metropole and the colonies, and to think about the ways in which tax is levied both across those populations, but also hierarchically in terms of Europeans in colonies versus Europeans at home, and so on. So that was really, really great. Thanks so much for that. And so now we move on to Laura for her presentation.
Thanks, Gominda. And also thank you to Gominda and Julia and Alex and Helen and the rest of the Tax Justice Network for organising all of this. It's been great to have something like this to look forward to. So the main aim of my chapter is to use taxation as a lens through which to examine how and why empires governed different people differently, and to examine through a case study of Sierra Leone how inequalities were built into the internal fiscal structure of colonies, kind of within the broader structure of a British imperial state. As we've talked about already, metropolitan taxpayers must figure into this as well. So studies of taxation inherently involve considerations of inequality. How do existing inequalities contribute to the design of tax structures? And in turn, how does spending and the potential for redistribution exacerbate or ameliorate inequality? The tendency for empires to govern different people differently, deliberately creating and maintaining distinctions as part of their strategy of rule, intersected with this pressure on colonial administrations to fund their colonies from local sources, as Madeleine has just been talking about. And this resulted in patchwork tax systems. By the late 19th century, most colonies are composites in some way. In the British Empire, you have combinations of crown colonies, protectorates, sometimes mandates, and all of them have cities and ports. Also in most colonies, there is no one tax that all subjects paid, and there was no one time in the fiscal year when all subjects were engaged in a tax process. So at the same time, in a kind of broader perspective, that Western states seem to be moving towards income taxes at the kind of late 19th, early 20th century, where they're assigning the same fiscal weight to each subject. Colonial governments seem to be imposing these piecemeal taxes that are dividing up their populations rather than integrating them into a common fiscal structure. So the chapter takes the form of a kind of within colony comparison of taxpayers in Sierra Leone during the early decades of colonial rule, so late 19th, early 20th century, with a particular focus on direct taxes. And it investigates the kind of categorical inequality between groups of taxpayers or fiscal subjects, as I've been calling them, particularly between the three core regions of the rural protectorate, the Crown Colony, and the Freetown municipality. The work of economists and economic historians has emphasized the importance of looking at both the tax and the spending side of the equation. And it's more than just a budget issue. It's something that signals the kind of fundamental values of society, including a balance of the social forces at play in these places. This seems particularly important in sharply segmented societies, especially like settler colonies. And several historians, economists, and political scientists have drawn attention to the impact of the distinctions inherent in especially white settler colonies for their tax systems. High tax rates were acceptable in some settler areas precisely because the redistributive expenditure was restricted to within these areas, and that settlers could guarantee that no tax revenue collected there could leak into other sections of the population. The segregation of local authorities ensured that there would be no transfer among groups. And the idea of this is that the kind of dual nature of these settler states attenuated any potential progressive tendency of direct taxes. But I think these arguments are relevant more widely than a handful of white settler colonies. And I think that this approach to internal divisions can actually tell us something more broadly about the kind of categorizing of colonial taxpayers. Sierra Leone is not a classic settler colony. It was Britain's oldest West African colony, taken over from a private company in 1808. And it's unusual in that it was originally founded as a settlement of freed slaves. Black settlers from London, Nova Scotia, and Jamaica, followed by liberated Africans from slave ships intercepted by the British Navy, arrived during the late 18th and early 19th century, populating Freetown and the Western Peninsula. Ruled as a standalone crown colony for much of the 19th century, the 1890s brought the scramble for Africa, and in 1896, the annexation of neighbouring territory as the protectorate. In 1893, a municipal council with a black settler majority was created in Freetown. So by 1900, Sierra Leone is a composite polity with a coastal colony, a rural protectorate, and this urban settler municipality, each with a distinct form of colonial governments, tax system, and a pattern of expenditure. So as I said, Sierra Leone is not categorized as a settler colony, but in this case, the specific urban context and the distinct population resident there with this city council that's responsible for taxation provide in a way this dual sense of a state where some of these theories from other colonies might help explain some of the fiscal patterns. Freetown's residents paid comparatively high municipal taxes to allow for things like developmental spending, such as on health, water provision, and sanitation, which was ring-fenced and retained strictly in these areas, thereby perpetuating overall inequality in the colony. An important point to note here is that direct taxes in Freetown are actually not levied by the colonial state. They're levied by this municipal council, which is actually elected by a very narrow portion of urban taxpayers, even though it's the colonial state's decision to allow any of this to happen. I think this really highlights the importance of balancing a regional and an aggregate perspective. And lots of colonial taxation studies look predominantly at tax revenues kind of at the whole colony level, but looking at this sub-colony level, you can, and also by including the expenditure side, reveals a more complex situation where expenditure was kind of potentially redistributive at a regional level, but not necessarily in the aggregate. So different systems of imperial governance developed to suit each region, and these involve different types of direct tax that were designed to capture different measures of wealth and that were based on, and in turn created, different kinds of information. The classic flat rate hut tax associated with indirect rule was imposed in the rural protectorate, and it relied heavily on local chiefs for assessment and collection. A separate tax was also levied in labour days, again administered by chiefs and designed to facilitate road building. In Freetown, a much more complex proportional tax that was based on a percentage of the assessed value of land and property was levied by this partially elected city council, not by the colonial government. The Crown Colony received a more hybrid system, and this was imposed by the colonial government, but was administered by unelected local advisory boards. As I said, a full picture of the colonial fiscal structure and the taxpayer experience requires taking into consideration the expenditure side of the equation as well. In particular, the ability of governments and interest groups to exert power over the spending of this revenue, as well as the potential for redistribution, makes it necessary to examine both sides together. While tax structures can look progressive in isolation, this can always be compromised by regressive patterns of expenditure, particularly in these very sharply segmented societies. The division of the institutions responsible for taxing and spending are really important here, and the revenue from direct tax in the protectorate is subsumed into the general budget of the colony, of the whole colony. While each district is funded by this budget, the actual revenue that's collected isn't retained in the areas. This ends up being spent on things like infrastructure, like roads, and lots on the salaries of European officials. In some years, it also subsidises the development of Freetown. In contrast, in both Freetown and in the Crown Colony, tax revenue was retained in the districts where it was collected and designated, well, a proportion of it is designated towards social spending and public works projects. In Freetown, this includes the electoral apparatus, at one stage a public library, lots of money spent on street lighting and water provision. The ring fencing of this spending of tax revenue made for a sharper and less permeable boundary between Freetown and the rest of Sierra Leone in both a geographical and a legal sense attached to individuals from each area. And as Madeline was talking about hierarchies, that very much applies here as well. There are different kind of categories and hierarchies of taxpayers. And I think this reflects and further reinforces the distinct character of each population. So while tax can be redistributive at a local level, it was not necessarily so at a colony level. And so finally, onto some kind of key implications of this approach for empires and inequality. And the main thing I'm really interested in here is the internal fiscal structure of colonies and the multiple different experiences of being a taxpayer and all under one colonial state. So some taxpayers are held at arm's length from the colonial state with very little information about them or any possible forms of wealth, and leading to these much more aggressive flat rate taxes and very few spending priorities, while others are more tightly governed, but not necessarily always by the colonial state. It's crucially important to ask who is actually doing the taxing and who has, which institutions have which fiscal powers. And then also to note the inequalities that open up as a result of the division of fiscal powers between levels of government. And particularly, I think this case shows how important it is to single out urban areas and the forms and levels of government and their powers in these cases within a broader context of a colony and an empire state as well. And finally, it allows us to disaggregate the effects of kind of geographical versus legal distinctions attached to individuals on fiscal policy. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much for that, Laura. And again, an additional sort of complication in terms of this aspect of how we take into account the role of private companies in the colonial project, because often when we talk about colonization, or the sort of standard assumptions around thinking about colonial processes are often about it being something carried out by states. And yet the more we look into it, it's not just states, it's also monarchs in their own right, it's private companies, the East India Company being a classic early example, as well as then the sorts of processes that David was outlining in his talk. So we've got time now, we've got a good sort of 40 to 45 minutes for discussion. So I'd really encourage colleagues who are watching this online to put questions into the Q&A or into the chat, and we can sort of build up a debate and discussion around some of these things. I mean, I think a couple of points that I would make in response to what the panel have put forward. One is around, I mean, and this was a question that came through the chat, and I think it was related to your talk, Julia, in terms of thinking about the ways in which you were talking about the Spanish monarchy using finance or sort of raising finance in a particular sort of way in order to enable its expansion into other areas. And the question that was raised was, does this indicate then a commercialization of sovereignty? Could we understand this period as a commercialization of sovereignty?
Thank you very much. Well, I think that perhaps not. I think what in David Brown's paper, looking at the kind of financialization of land and the commercialization of land as a kind of way of financing empire, I don't think the kind of the phrase commercialization of sovereignty would quite fit in that it's not being kind of placed on a market value. It's rather a kind of movement between different forms of capital that's not necessarily in relation to a market. So I'm not sure whether this idea of commercialization of sovereignty would quite work. Rather, it's perhaps a way of rethinking what sovereignty is and how this kind of idea of political capital relates to economic capital and who has the monopoly of that.
Okay, great. And then another question, I think this was sort of directed more towards you, David, was asking about the status of Ireland. So I think it was Nigel Munasami who was asking the question of whether can we consider Ireland at that time as being a state and therefore as being invaded, or how would we think about the relationship between Ireland and England and then later on Britain? What was the status of Ireland at this time?
Well, we consider that it was a state, which I think is the important point to make here. It was a collection of lordships that had had a high king for hundreds of years. A dispute between a high king and one of his underlings caused him to invite a mercenary army to come over. They weren't expecting an invasion, and they weren't expecting Henry II to follow a few years later and demand the subjugation of all the leading lords that he could basically pull into his orbit. The relationship was really between France, England, and Ireland, because it was effectively a king of French extraction who was ruling England at the time, and it's the Anglo-Normans who came to Ireland. Englishness itself is quite a fuzzy thing to describe at this time. So I think as a medieval polity, Ireland had existed as a kingdom with a united high king for a long time, even through the Danish period and before and after the Danish period. So I think we can happily say that it was a nation that was invaded and then later subjugated, not successfully for a long time. It was a very, very long process that only reached its apex in the early 17th century, or maybe under Elizabeth a little bit earlier when things got very, very violent. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think we could say, yes, it was a nation that had been invaded.
And can I just sort of follow up with that? Because there's been a debate recently, I think Fintan O'Toole was one of the people sort of saying or contesting this idea of Ireland having been colonized by England and sort of pointing to the Acts of Union and so sort of resisting the narrative of Ireland having been a colony. How would you sort of set out the nature of that debate at the moment? I mean, what's your sense of it?
Well, Fintan does his thing. There are, shall we say, more Republican historians, some more nationalist historians, as opposed to ones who have misinterpreted history. So there's really two sides to an argument here. No, I basically wouldn't agree with him. I mean, we look at this long chain of disasters under English rule that include things like the famine that happened after the Act of Union, when agricultural produce was still being exported from Ireland and taxes were still being collected throughout the 1840s and 1850s. So the Act of Union itself was basically just a really grubby backroom deal done in the Irish House of Lords to enable more of this extraction to take place in Westminster where nobody could oppose it. But that is the way many historians would now look at the Act of Union. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's how Scottish historians looked at your Act of Union, I don't know. But no, I don't think he's correct, to be honest.
Okay, well, it'll be interesting. I mean, I think also when we start sort of looking at these issues of tax and how those particular institutions or how the institution of tax comes to play out in particular ways, there was a quite good article by somebody called George Wingate back in the mid-19th century who compared the taxation of India and the land rents in Ireland as two of the most equivalent forms of extraction carried out by the British Empire. And so there's an interesting comparison to be made there. There was a question also then for Madeline around this this notion. I'm just trying to find it again. Well, I guess this idea, because partly you were talking about this aspect of financial autonomy, and the question is, how do we then sort of situate financial autonomy in the context of the empire as a whole? Because the colony is not to be if it's financially autonomous, it's not politically autonomous, it's politically subordinate to the metropole. And so does using the language of financial autonomy potentially give rise to an understanding that these are people doing their own thing and not doing it under conditions of sort of subjugation or oppression or so on?
Absolutely, no, and I do think, I mean, I use the term autonomy because it was the term used at the time, but it's obviously a very misleading term because that didn't make colonies autonomous at all. Or if it did, it made Europeans in the colonies, especially later on, especially in the interwar period, it gave Europeans more power, especially those who were sitting on local assemblies. In Algeria, it was the financial delegations. In the southern colony of in Indochina, Cochinchina, it would have been the colonial council. And so European settlers did harness the financial autonomy to their own advantage. But yes, absolutely, the language is the one that was used then, which is, you know, which is obviously very misleading. But I still wanted to use it because, you know, I believe in using and interrogating the categories of the past, which, you know, I mean, I'm happy to talk as well about, I saw there was another question on Europeans, so I don't know if we were.
No, go ahead.
Because yes, I think, so this is another project that I'm working on right now, which might take the form of an article, which is precisely about how Europeans and European communities in the empire harnessed autonomy and created, you know, and carved out privileges, tax privileges for themselves. And I trace how, for instance, in Indochina, Europeans often resisted the introduction of income taxes, or, you know, a more modern and redistributive type of taxation, often imposed by the metropole. But it's interesting to see how difficult it was for the metropole to impose even just a modicum of tax justice. So yes, I guess one could say that autonomy was eventually weaponized by settler communities. You see the same thing in Algeria too, where you know, it's extremely difficult throughout the 19th century to impose a land tax on European settlers, right, who justified the exemption as a sort of financial premium for colonization. You see the same thing in Madagascar throughout the 1920s. You know, one could multiply examples. And you know, that's what I tried to do. But you see, like, remarkably similar episodes of settler tax resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, that's incredibly interesting, because I think that aspect of getting colonized subjects to pay for their own colonization is something that we see also within the British Empire. So after the Irish Rebellion of 1798 and what's called the Indian Mutiny of 1857, income taxes are levied on the colonized populations in order to pay for the military incursions to have colonized those populations. And so this is a practice that's repeated by the British quite significantly. And just to sort of think about these issues also in terms of the contemporary situation, I mean, one of the things, and I imagine this is similar in other European empires, but the British officials of the India office, for example, in India, had their salaries paid by the taxes of colonized subjects. They themselves didn't pay any income tax on their salaries in that context, and instead then also gained pensions for life, furloughs, holiday pay, child benefits, all these sorts of things. So they received immense welfare payouts from the taxes of colonized subjects, whilst themselves not paying any tax whatsoever. And so it'd be interesting to think about how those patterns reproduce themselves now in national contexts as well. There was a question for you, Laura, from Andrew McKillop, asking about whether the diversity of the financial arrangements that you outlined in your talk in relation to Sierra Leone is an indication of the colonial state's strength or of its contingency, or perhaps even its reliance on local agency. I was wondering if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I very much come at this from the perspective that Madeline has been talking about, which is there's a real pressure from Britain that these colonies have to be funded by local sources, and however that works best. And I think that kind of pressure to find things locally is what feeds into the division of tax systems into different parts, because one tax that might work in one place would absolutely not work elsewhere. And I think that's again where I spend a lot of time thinking about how much of this is driven by kind of urban versus rural contexts. But I think, for example, when Britain annexed, just in the Sierra Leone case, which is very comparable to certainly other places in West Africa, when the protectorate is annexed in 1896, there are very, very few European officials actually there that could impose a tax. And that's why the flat rate is the only way to go. It has to be a flat rate. In fact, they try and do a kind of dual rates based on how many rooms each hut has, and it's completely impossible. And even 10 years later, they're finding villages that have slipped through the net and they haven't paid tax once yet. Whereas in Freetown, which has been developing as a very important Atlantic port city for over 100 years by this point, urban property ownership, everything is much closer together. It's much easier to, know somebody's house number on whatever street, be able to have a tax assessor go around and look at who lives where, who owns, who occupies different places, and draw up a tax register. And those tax registers exist. Individuals' names, properties, the assessed value, and for example, what the property is being used for. But in the protectorate, everything is, certainly in the earlier stages, all the records are by chief and by village. Nothing goes down to the kind of level of the actual hut that taxes, the kind of unit of taxation. And I think that the inability of these colonial states to basically provide the infrastructure for anything more intensive than a flat rate is an indication of actually that this was far beyond the administrative capacity of what was present, certainly in these early years. Things changed later on, but I think that actually this is a sign of trying to operate well beyond the bounds of kind of being realistic about the administrative capacity at that stage. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to group a few questions together now. There's a couple of questions for you, Julia. One is around from Florencia Lorenzo asking, what do you understand as public in an imperial context, and suggests that by employing the concept of public-private partnerships, are you not equating a political structure with the public even before discussions on public sovereignty have occurred? So that's one question. And then there was another question from Laila Latif, who was arguing whether who was asking the question around imperial charity funds, such as the fund under the Colonial Development Act. Was it just a form of extraction under the guise of charity and development, or would you consider it as a form of charity? So perhaps if you could take those two questions.
Thank you very much. So I think this question on the public-private partnership, in a way, it's kind of introducing a binary, which the chapter in the end will problematize, because the point underlying the argument that I'm trying to make in the paper is that that sovereignty is kind of being constructed through this relationship. And as you say, it's not kind of feeding into this notion of popular sovereignty, thinking about consent, but perhaps a different kind of process that this paper is identifying. The issue of consent, which is central to popular sovereignty, is important to the way that the Crown is theorizing sovereignty. This was important to the way that it justified its colonization in the Americas. The likes of Francisco de Vitoria was writing about the importance of consent. But I think that in this case, the public is kind of how people are making different claims on sovereignty. But I think that kind of problematizing this idea of a binary of public and private will be a way to kind of rethink what we understand to be the state and to be sovereignty. And then the second question, what was the question again? Sorry, it was
around the imperial charity funds. and whether the calling of something in relation to charity was actually for other purposes. Let me just find the question again. Whether the fund under the Colonial Development Act, for example, was just a form of extraction under the guise of charity that was about sort of keeping local groups from reorganizing the colonial order.
I see. So I'm not. I think it's just kind of looking about into the future. Is that right? Like sort of thinking about the later interpretations of this. So I'm not so familiar with the Colonial Development Act, but there's been a lot of critiques, including from prominent Latin American scholars, Arturo Escobar and so on, that have looked at this longer history of giving and of charity, and have seen the kind of legacies within development. And one could argue that we see this kind of process starting with the origins of empire and then continuing into development. So I think there is a kind of aspect of continuity there.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think there's a couple of general questions which perhaps if any of the colleagues would like to respond to. One is from Su-Ming Ku, who was directing it specifically to you, Julia, but I think it also works for the other panelists around the play between sort of equity and inequality and what we might think about this. I mean, in part, I guess she's asking whether we're often asked to replace equality with equity in justice-oriented policies, and whether that has traction in terms of the questions that we're engaging with. And another question from Nigel Munasami is, could we say that tax inequality was a greater reason for the eventual breakup of empires than racial questions? I mean, I guess partly the issue is that we can't necessarily separate out tax from race, given the way in which tax was racialized in its implementation. But it also points to the fact that of thinking about the economic structures of colonial and imperial projects, which are organized around some form of a racialized understanding. And it's important not to to think about those things together. So would anybody like to start off responding to either of those? Yeah, Madeline, go ahead.
Happy to take on the second question really quickly. I think this is a really interesting one. And as you said, Gurminder, yes, tax was always racialized. It's very difficult to, and maybe not even that useful to try to disentangle the two. What I tried to do in my own work was really to understand the role of fiscal inequities and especially the role of tax revolts in the making of anti-colonial movements and thought. Of course, everyone knows about Gandhi's Salt March and the role of tax resistance in anti-colonial resistance. But and I guess it's maybe more. It has been explored maybe at greater length in the British case, but in the French case, we still know very little, in fact, about tax revolts and the role that they played. And yet they were, there were an enormous amount of them throughout the colonial period, especially after that 1900 moment, but also in the 1930s. So, and they're extremely synchronous. For instance, in Algeria, throughout the 1930s, you have, early Algerian nationalists using tax resistance as a tool to, just to enter the public sphere on their own terms as well. Communists in Indochina are using tax resistance as well as a tool. So yes, this is absolutely something we still need to inquire more about, but it's clearly, yes, I think taxation, economic inequality in general played an enormous role, I think, in anti-colonial resistance.
Great. Anybody else? Laura, did you want to?
Can you remind me of the first question that you asked?
So one was around sort of debates around equity and inequality, and whether the difference between those two concepts, which even though they're related, might make a difference to the ways in which we're thinking about these issues. I mean, it was directed at Julia, that particular one, but
yeah, and I could, sorry. Yeah, go for it. It's fine.
I could come in just briefly on that first one. I think it's really interesting to think that our concept of equality and inequality are not sort of universals, but the products of historical processes. They have an intellectual history. And there's a very interesting project on the global intellectual history of inequality run by the University of Aarhus that has a blog of different scholars from around the world responding to that particular question. And this question, I know that is shaping debates in other disciplines, history and law today. And actually there's a directing to another interesting article by Francesca Trivolata, who looks at the debates in the Middle Ages between equalitas and equitas, and how scholastics were debating these Aristotelian notions, and kind of which notion ends up sort of winning out effectively during these kind of medieval debates. And I think that it's so I think that kind of looking at the historical processes of kind of what ideas goes forward and what gets thought of in terms of different aspects of status and what's kind of needs to be distributed to certain groups. Inequalities become coded in imperial settings.
Okay, great. I mean, Laura, there was a direct question that was in the chat for you around whether, you know, with Freetown paying more taxes than the rest of the protectorates, did it translate to increased development efforts for Freetown residents? And then a related question, were they overtaxed in the process?
I think in terms of defining overtaxed is quite difficult, but I think what's important in questions like this is the specific council that is doing that is imposing these taxes is run by residents of Freetown. It's not run by the colonial government, and it is partially elected. But there are two taxes that are paid. One is a kind of general city rate, and that goes to things like street lighting and sanitation and things like this. And there's another tax specifically for water provision, and that is something that nowhere else has. And that remains the responsibility of the city council. And there's a very kind of tense relationship between the city council and the colonial government, because the colonial government really has a final say on a lot of things. And the council always worry that they're about to lose responsibility for certain aspects. But water provision is one thing that they retain the power for the tax, and they retain the power for running that as well. And these taxes are actually also combined with like quite heavy license fees that almost act as a double tax. And so when you talk about being overtaxed, actually there are really interesting inequalities within the Freetown population as well, in terms of actually the people who are on this city council are doctors and lawyers that have often in fact come to the UK and done their training here and gone back to Freetown and opened up legal practices and things there, and they run this council, and the kind of professional occupation pay much lower license fees than things like trades, much lower. So it's almost kind of functioning as a kind of a second tax, these license fees, and so there are really interesting kind of dynamics there. And of course, the more professional classes, some of them see the payment of the city tax, they explicitly refer to it as a kind of step towards self-government, and so they're actually very pleased to be being taxed, but they're taxing themselves. And that's another quote: the kind of city council gets set up so that this population can tax themselves rather than being taxed by the colonial government. So there's a really different perception of actually how this tax is functioning, and what is being paid for using the revenue from it. And it really differs as to along the lines of occupation and wealth within Freetown, let alone considering the kind of other parts of the entire colony as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So there's two questions now which are general questions, and I was going to ask David perhaps to respond first in the context of Ireland. One of the questions is around, did any of the empires ever establish eventual equal tax or welfare treatment for native peoples? And then related to that is a question from Thomas O'Hara, asking whether in the post-colonial state, to what extent do the fiscal systems and structures that were established under sort of colonial rule were carried forward into the fiscal structures of post-colonial states? So what sort of legacies can we see that might structure the current situation in terms of this colonial past that we've discussed briefly?
From the equality point of view, I'm getting back to this thing about the Act of Union. for the entire 18th century, we had these things called the penal laws, which were laws to suppress Catholicism and also Catholic wealth. So you couldn't own a horse worth more than £5 or inherit a house or give your estate to anyone who wasn't a male relative and wasn't a poor. This the sort of thing that was very much ingrained in society and kept the Catholic population poor. As the penal laws were beginning to wind down and the writing was on the wall, that's really when the Act of Union comes into play, because they were going to lose, in the Irish House of Parliament, the ascendancy were going to lose their majority. So it was shifted over to Westminster, where a larger majority would always hold sway. From a taxation point of view, again, things were introduced from England, especially in the 1660s, this idea of taxing an entire population. So we have feudal taxation, of course, for a millennia before lots of the more modern ones, but the introduction of things like excise and the introduction of things like poll taxes and various other duties that people invent along the way, they all came into Ireland very, very quickly in kind of one slice. So it went from being a population that wasn't taxed, apart from the elite, to a population where everybody basically had to pay some kind of tax. Society had to have money introduced to it to pay these taxes. So an awful lot of changes took place in Ireland as a result of these taxes that were imposed. Ireland always exported, both in terms of, it depends what you consider to be exploitation, whether it's the actual pound, shilling and pence taken out of the country, or whether it's the cheap commodities and the cheap labour and all these other things that are also taken out over a great many number of years that keep a country poorer than its colonial master. So I don't think it really is a taxation equality thing, and I don't think you can separate it out. I mean, you can go into records, you can see how much Ireland contributed net to the English exchequer and how much money was paid in the other direction. And that varies over time, depending if there's a Napoleonic war, more money is taken out of Ireland and paid into the English exchequer, more people are taken out to fight those wars and so on. In times of peace, it reverses a bit. So I don't think it is a continual pattern, but I wouldn't treat it separately from the use of resources in the territory, because that's probably a bigger issue.
Do you see its legacies into the present as well? I mean, do you see that there's ways in which this colonial inheritance structures contemporary financial institutions within Ireland?
We kept all the British institutions at independence in 1922. We have a bicameral legislature. We have a president to replace a monarch. We have the same common law legal system. We obviously have lots and lots of things that happened over time, but I think you say the legal systems are really very, very similar. Society is structured in quite a similar way. Okay. You know, we don't have the same imperial legacy from other countries within the same network that they have, say, in England. And Ireland has always been sort of quite, until very recently, it was quite a monoculture. That's only really changed in the past 25, 30 years. So socially very different, but in terms of sort of economic, legal structures, governance and so on, I think we simply kept what was left to us and carried on with it in our own way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Would anybody else like to respond in relation to either the Spanish Empire or the French Empire, or in the context?
So I'll say something briefly about the Spanish Empire, if that's okay. So it's an interesting question. So the Spanish Empire is often held up as a kind of example within a global comparative of why, you know, the Latin America is poor today, has high levels of inequality, and new institutional economists have argued that this is as a result of the legacy of colonial structures, of the inheriting the institutions of the Spanish Empire in comparison with the British Empire. And this has also been like critiqued in more recent scholarship. And I think that a lot of the kind of questions around poverty and inequality in Latin America, you can clearly see coming from the imposition of neoliberal economics in the modern period, rather than being a hangover of colonialism per se, although it's also a mixed picture because there are issues around like failed land redistribution and so on. But I think that now we're sort of challenging some of this kind of idea of the Spanish Empire being particularly having weak institutions, and so on. So this is one of the kind of importance of this comparison, that we can sort of challenge some of the models that have been put forward, such as by new institutional economics and so on.
Great, thanks for that, Julia. Madeline and Laura, did you want to respond to that? And there's a question that's sort of related to that around whether the limited capacity of colonial states to tax and the resulting peculiar tax regimes are the main legacy of imperialism in Africa, as opposed to, say, a transfer of wealth via taxation from the colony to the metropole. This is from Jelmer Voss. Who would like to go first?
Sure. I think this, yeah, an interesting way of thinking about this is I was recently talking to a political scientist who works on informal taxation in Sierra Leone in very, very recent contexts. And we had a lot more in common than we thought we were going to in terms of the research topics we were interested in. For example, the existence of mostly what I've talked about today are kind of taxes paid in money to a state, but these coexist with taxes paid by kind of much more local level, regional level population groups to a local chief, or to a kind of more local level organization. And these are both paid in money and also in labor. And that is apparently, according to kind of research in political science, a kind of balance that is absolutely kind of still in place late in the kind of late 20th century still, which I wasn't, I've very much worked on a kind of historical context. I think one of the interesting problems that you have to get around as a historian in terms of looking at a colonial context and then a kind of post-colonial context is the sources that you're going to use. Empire, certainly the British Empire, produced a lot of statistical information on their taxes, and that drops off when places become independent. And so actually being able to trace the kind of mechanics of what is happening is actually quite difficult, and actually there's a lot less done on this than the kind of beginning of the colonial period and the actual kind of setting up of these colonial tax regimes. So it's definitely, would be a really kind of exciting thing to carry on these kind of projects and look at those kind of questions for sure. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Madeline, would you like to?
Yeah, so just a few things on post-colonial legacies. Yeah, I mean, these are interesting, very interesting questions that I've been trying to tackle as well in my own work. I've been mostly interested in probing the ways in which, for instance, there's a whole debate, and I talked a bit less about this today, but there's a whole debate in the French Empire about taxing rights. For instance, I've been able to trace how French colonial firms often, shifted their headquarters to the colonies in order to pay a smaller corporate tax than they would have paid if they were in the metropole. And so I've been able to trace how the discussion about imperial rights, imperial taxing rights in the French Empire back then very much influenced how the international tax system was starting to be organized during that period. And so that's one of the post-colonial legacies that I find most interesting, especially as we are today talking about how to reform international taxing rights between the global North and the global South. So this is a less well-known aspect, I think, of those post-colonial legacies that I think are interesting to probe. I'm also, something that I guess also Vanessa Ogle will talk about later is really how, because I became really obsessed with how European communities refused or resisted income taxes, and how that low tax morale really helped create or mold the modern tax havenry. So this is something I think that needs still much more research, and I think the origins of that phenomenon are to be found in the tax politics that were happening during the colonial period, and that included and so that's why I think Europeans and the way they were taxed or not taxed need to be put back into the picture. Yeah, I guess, probably other things will come to mind, but these were really the two things I wanted to say on post-colonial legacies.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've got another sort of general question and a couple of specific questions. One general question from Wayne Green is, how important do you think the work of Walter Rodney of the underdevelopment of Africa is to the historical context of political economies to this debate? So if any of you would like to respond to that, and I'll just put in, given that we're coming up to the end, there's two specific questions. One to Madeline from Samuel Sanchez asking, that wanted to know whether you examined the pressures and lobbying campaigns opposing the divergent interests of the different colonies and the extent to which some colonies could be considered winners and losers in the imperial context. And I think this one's more directed towards you, Laura, although it's a different context from the one that you're focusing on, particularly from Kojo Bonsu asking, in Kenya and Zimbabwe, in the context of colonial and imperial policies, what was the reason, benefit, and legacy of imposing the hut tax? So if anybody would like to respond to the Walter Rodney question, and then there are the specific questions to Madeline and Laura as well. Laura, do you want to maybe go first?
Yeah, sure. Certainly the work of people like Walter Rodney has very much, I think, is an important part of the trajectory that's got us to where people are now studying colonial taxation. I think that I don't think people would be focusing on topics such as colonial taxation, whether they're kind of looking at it in a more kind of qualitative sense or in a very quantitative, counting up tax burdens, who is paying what, where did that tax burden fall, things like that. I think people like Walter Rodney are kind of very important in the foundations of the kind of perspectives that people are now coming at this kind of topic from. More specifically about Kenya and Zimbabwe, is it? I think this is a really good question and gets very much to the topic about the kind of the relative economic importance of different kinds of tax. And actually, there's a very, very good book on this by Lee Gardner at the LSE called Taxing Colonial Africa. And she looks at the tax composition. Kenya is one of her case studies, and she looks at the balance between indirect taxes and direct taxes and how this varied. She has a few chapters that kind of cover the whole of the British Empire in Africa as well. And the point that she makes is that in West Africa, actually, the colonies there are much more commercially developed than those in East and Southern Africa, and are able to get a much higher proportion of their overall budget from indirect taxes on trade, mostly on imports. And by doing that, it's actually much easier to get taxes like that. You can tax at a port or just at a kind of few specific places, and you don't have to have the administration that's required for a direct tax on, for example, property or a poll tax or things like that. So it's actually much easier to collect. And for example, Southern Nigeria and the Gold Coast actually don't even get a direct tax until much later in the 20th century. Sierra Leone is actually unusual in a way in West Africa. And the hut tax in Sierra Leone provides around about 15% of overall revenue, because so much more of it can come from trade taxes. Whereas in East Africa, less commercially developed, or certainly less history of commercial development by this late 19th century point. And so much more of the budget has to come from things like hut taxes, up to kind of 50+%. come from direct taxes compared to these indirect ones. So that's the kind of really important balance to think about in those kind of comparisons as between direct and indirect taxes. But yeah, it's a really good book that will give you much more on that. Thanks.
Great. David, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, we had something very similar here in the 1660s. We had what was called a hearth tax that was brought in 1660. In 1659, they had a poll tax. And the problem with the poll tax was that once anybody saw a party of Cromwellian soldiers crossing a hill, they ran away. So they decided to tax the buildings that they lived in instead. We then developed a class of huts, as they basically were. They were very similar, conical, basically made out of plantation. So basically plant-based building materials that didn't have any hearts in them, and they could be picked up and moved around as well. And I think, like Laura was saying, there were also about 15% of the tax take when the hearth tax was running, which is interesting. And people who lived in English-style stone buildings didn't pay the same type of tax or tax at the same level. So a stone house, which was worth 20 or 30 times more than one of these movable huts, if it only had one hearth in it, it paid the same tax. So a form of inequality was built into taxing what sounds to me like a very, very similar structure that they seem to have basically gone, we used to do that, let's try doing this in a different jurisdiction. So it was just a comparison I thought was interesting.
Oh, no, that's great. Thanks so much for that. Madeline, do you want to?
Yeah, I might just jump in quickly on the Walter Rodney question and then Samuel Sanchez's question. So on Walter Rodney, and I guess also more generally, dependency theory and understandings of the global economy as colonial, this has clearly shaped my thinking about taxation. And I think there still needs to be, I guess, more work on theorizing what colonial taxation was and asking even, was it taxation at all? I mean, I guess, and that's what I try to develop in my own work when I speak of, so I generally say that I write a critical fiscal history of French imperialism, which, you know, tries to not necessarily take those category of fiscal capacity or taxation as granted. What if they're just seizures? You know, is it taxation at all if you don't have a say at all in what you're supposed to, you know, what you're being asked to pay? So I guess that this more critical tradition of thinking about the global economy and colonialism is crucial if we are to, you know, think more theoretically about what colonial taxation was. So clearly, yes, Rodney's work and dependency theory more generally has been hugely influential in my own work. As for Samuel Sanchez's question, this is really interesting, and I must say that his own work on taxation in Madagascar was really helpful as I was writing the dissertation and now the book. I wonder if he's referring to customs revenue, because something I should say is that customs revenue were not under the control of colonies. So colonies were financially autonomous as far as direct and indirect taxes were concerned. But the metropole retained a power over customs revenue because it had this protectionist system, much more so than in the British context. There's the 1892 Méline law that subsumes most colonies under the protectionist regime. This was not the case for some West African colonies, which were, you know, had signed treaties with England before and were, you know, under an open door policy. So they were clearly, I would say, winners and losers in the sense that, for instance, Madagascar or Indochina were subsumed under the protectionist regime. So they did not have free access or as free access to revenue, to customs revenue. So that clearly constrained their revenue structure. This was less true for West African colonies, which had greater access to customs revenue, and were not under this metropolitan diktat, or at least not as much as places like Indochina and Madagascar. And obviously, there's a lot of lobbying going on, especially on the side of the French businessmen operating in Indochina, asking for more autonomous customs revenue policy for Indochina.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Madeline. And with that, we're up at time for this session. So I'd like to thank the panelists for fantastic papers that generated an excellent discussion. And thank you all for your questions and comments in relation to this. We're going to take a short break now. So we'll have a 15-minute break and we'll start the next session, which is looking at welfare regimes, taxation and resistance and local resistance to these at 3:15. So thanks again to the panelists. Thank you for your questions, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.